Before we start, if you want more updates from TLDR, then you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram, where we were posting all day yesterday about the budget. Get explainers that never make it to YouTube and breaking news by following at TLDR News UK. So yesterday, the Chancellor delivered his much anticipated budget. While it wasn't the most exciting budget, because most of the big announcements had already been briefed to the press, there were some interesting surprises, which we'll break down right now. Before we get into the budget itself, this particular budget requires a bit of context. The Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, faced some criticism in the lead-up for doing two things. Firstly, Treasury ministers have been briefing the media about the budget in advance. This is something that basically every Chancellor for the last 50 years or so has done, and it makes sense. You want to drip feed your popular policies and spending pledges, because otherwise, if you wait until budget day, all of your popular policies get drowned out by your other popular policies, or worse, your unpopular ones. Nonetheless, briefing the media about important parliamentary business before you tell the House of Commons is against the ministerial code. And this year's have been particularly controversial because of how blatant they've been, with a lot of official statements, as well as the usual secret briefings to well-connected journalists. This especially annoyed Speaker of the House Lindsay Hoyle, who on Monday seemed to suggest that Sunak should resign, with a veiled reference to the former Labour Chancellor, Hugh Dalton, who had to resign after telling a journalist about tax changes before his 1947 budget.
I repeat to the government, if it persists in making announcements, first outside this House, ministers will be called to account to this chamber. And I would say the Chair of Ways and Means that oversees the budget is also very upset at the briefing that's gone out. At one time, ministers did the right thing if they briefed before a budget. They won't. Seems to me, yes, absolutely resign. Seems to me we've got ourselves in a position that if you've not got it out 5 days before, it's not worth putting out. Well, I've got to say, members are elected to this House to represent their constituents. Those constituents, quite rightly, expect the MP to hear it first in order to be able to listen to what the budget's about, but also for the days following that to hold them to account. It's not acceptable, and the government shouldn't try to run roughshod over this House. It will not happen.
Hoyle was still grumpy on Tuesday when he took the opportunity to remind ministers of their obligation under the ministerial code and forced the government to list all of the budget policies they'd announced ahead of time via an urgent question. Simon Clarke, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, mentioned 4 policies, but at least 9 others had already been announced before the budget even happened. The other reason that Sunak has been in trouble is that of all of the policies announced, some of them have been a little ambiguous. For example, the $7 billion on transport briefed to the media on Saturday is actually more like $1.5 billion, on top of what's already been announced, something that Sunak was forced to admit on Sunday.
You've already announced that there's going to be a £7 billion for new transport projects outside London. Can you confirm that just £1.5 billion of that money hasn't been announced previously?
So the transport money that we announced is a combination of two things. One, we'd previously announced an overall envelope to improve how people get around our big cities. We previously announced £4.2 billion for that. What we've actually done is top that up, as you said, by £1.5 billion.
Similarly, the announcement that the NHS would be getting an extra £6 billion was described by the IFS as incomprehensible, because the Department for Health and Social Care's capital budget isn't even finalised for future years, which means it's meaningless to say that you're giving it any extra funding. And there wasn't even a timeline provided for said funding. Anyway, context out of the way, what actually happened in the chamber during the budget? Well, Sunak started by talking about inflation. The OBR now expects inflation, as measured by CPI, to hit 4.4% in 2022, a lot more than the 1.8% expected by the OBR back in March. Obviously, this isn't politically good for the government. Unsurprisingly, constituents don't like increases to their cost of living. But it's also an economic concern, because high inflation could also force the Bank of England to increase interest rates. We're not going to go into this in too much detail now, but the basic idea is that if inflation gets too high and prices are rising too quickly, the bank will need to increase interest rates to basically slow the economy down. Because in theory, high interest rates mean less borrowing and more saving. Anyway, this would make further borrowing and servicing of current debt a lot more expensive. In fact, Sunak said in his speech that a 1% increase in interest rates would cost the government £23 billion. This is why a recurring theme in this budget was the Chancellor's desire to keep borrowing down. And Sunak actually set himself and the Treasury 2 new fiscal rules: that public sector net debt must be falling and that the state should only borrow for investments, while paying for so-called everyday spending with taxation. According to the OBR's forecast, the government is on track to meet that first criterion by 2025, with public sector debt set to increase to 85.7% in 2023, before falling in 2024 to 8.5%, and then all the way down to 83.3% in 2026. The second criterion is a bit more vague and depends mostly on your preferred definition of investment. But today's tax burden is the highest it's been since the 70s, according to IFS data. So it is hard to argue that the government is undertaxing already. Nonetheless, for all of his talk about fiscal responsibility, this was actually a relatively generous budget. Not as generous as the pandemic budget, but still pretty generous by Conservative standards. The budget also included a real funding increase for every government department, which is remarkable, given that most departments have suffered real-term funding cuts since 2010. There was also a lot of money for the more standard stuff. $6 billion for the NHS, $5.7 billion to level up transport outside of London. But there were also some more interesting policies, and we're going to look at 4 of them now. The new money for local government, the new money for skills, the changes to alcohol taxes, and the changes for domestic flights. So let's start with the new money for local government. Sunak has set aside £4.8 billion in core funding for local governments over the next 3 years, which means that the Department for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities local government funding will increase by 9.4% to £12.5 billion annually by 2024-2025. A larger percentage increase than any other government department. This is pretty unequivocally a good thing, because local governments have suffered pretty terrible cuts since the Tories took over in 2010. So reversing this trend of cuts is a good thing for local services. On the money for new skills, the government is spending £3 billion on skills training for the UK's adult population, including a new scheme for adult numeracy called Multiply. This is also a pretty good idea, given that the UK population's numeracy skills aren't great by international standards, and that UK adults aren't very good at reskilling. In fact, right now, fewer adults are switching between jobs than at any time in the past 70 years, in part because it's not easy to reskill in the UK. And that's not just bad for people who are stuck in their current jobs, it's bad for the wider economy, because it entails an insufficient distribution of labour across the entire economy. One of the more headline-grabbing announcements from the budget today were the reforms to alcohol duty. While previous chancellors have attempted to reform the duties by increasing or decreasing the duty on specific types of drinks, today Sunak has attempted to fundamentally rework the system. And to be fair, it's easy to see why he's done this, because currently the system is a bit of a mess. The result of this overly complicated system is huge differences to the amount of tax on different alcohol, with it all depending on what kind of alcoholic drink you're consuming. Chancellor Sunak has proposed a 5-point plan to address the old complicated system. The first point is to reduce the main duty rates from 16 to 5. With the Chancellor claiming that these new duty rates would follow the principle of the stronger the drink, the higher the rate, which would see some drinks increase in price and others decrease, with Prosecco and Champagne notably dropping in price. The second of his 5 points is expanding the small brewers' relief. Currently, the small brewers' relief lowers the amount of beer duty that needs to be paid by small craft brewers. Rather than just beer producers though, Sunak has now announced that this plan will be increased to all alcoholic producers who produce alcoholic drinks with less than 8.5% alcohol content. The fourth change that's been implemented will benefit pubs, with the Chancellor highlighting that between 2000 and 2019, consumption at pubs has fallen by 40%. To aid pubs across the country, draft duty will be implemented to cut the duty paid by pubs by about 5%. Speaking of pubs, elsewhere in the speech, Sunak announced that pubs, cinemas, gyms, and other venues in the leisure industry will get a 50% reduction in their business rates. And all other businesses are set to benefit too, with the increase in business rates set for next year being entirely scrapped. Another change worth mentioning is Sunak's slightly odd decision to cut taxes for domestic flights in the UK and freeze fuel duty. Freezing fuel duty is understandable in some sense. Fuel prices are rising, so it does seem somewhat logical. But it's hard to see how cutting taxes on domestic flights squares with the government's climate agenda. And it's just not a good look before COP26, when the government wants to paint itself as a leader in the world's green agenda. Finally, let's talk about the last thing in Sunak's speech, an area where the government has come under quite a lot of fire lately: universal credit. The government has been criticised for reducing the benefit by £20 a week earlier this month, and Sunak attempts to balance this criticism by reducing the UC taper. Previously, the taper rate meant that for every additional £1 you earned over the work allowance, 63p would be removed from your benefit payment. Essentially, a way of slowly reducing payments while incentivising work. Under the new scheme though, you'd only lose 55p for every additional pound earned. However, critics say that this change isn't nearly enough, and wouldn't offset the £20 a week reduction in UC for the vast majority of the lowest earners. But what do you think? Are these good policies to make Britain better, or are you unimpressed with how it treats the lowest paid and the environment? Comment your thoughts down below. And if you want to get even more involved, then head over to our Instagram and Twitter. Over there, we've been talking a lot about the budget, sharing summaries, opinions, and breaking news. And it's not even just the budget. We're doing this for a variety of topics, including the upcoming COP26 summit, which we'll be breaking down on @TLDR News UK. As always, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that is in the description.